Hello, I'm Robert Knowles.
And I'm Richard Simpson, and we're going to cover today Phase 1 of the Battle of Vimy Ridge.
On April 8th into the morning of April 9th, the Canadians were moved into position and prepared for battle. At 05:30 on April 9th, every Canadian gun available opened up, and the Germans woke up to the thunderous roar of the Canadian guns.
The Stars and Stripes went into battle for the first time during the World War during the recent Entente storming of Vimy Ridge in France, according to an unofficial dispatch received here today from Canadian headquarters in Europe. Quote, to a young Texan who came to Ontario to enlist and who is now laying wounded in a hospital, unquote. The dispatch reads, quote, begins the honor of the first carrying the American flag into battle in the European War, into which the United States, as a belligerent, just entered. He went up to the assault at Thalys, carrying the Stars and Stripes on his bayonet, and fell thus. The dispatch says that the victory of the Canadians in the struggle for Vimy Ridge is more thorough than indicated by first reports. Already, 3,200 men, including 60 officers, have been recorded, and many more are to come. Advices indicate that Canadian casualties around Vimy were 89 officers. At the usual percentage would mean about 1,200 men. The figures are considered light in view of the number engaged.
30 seconds after the Canadian guns opened up, the Canadian engineers detonated mines in no man's land, destroying many key German strongholds to make it easier for the advancing Canadian troops. By 06:25, the Canadians of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Divisions had reached their first objective.
Before noon yesterday, one Canadian cage had 500 prisoners, said one of the men reaching here from the front. One of the first things that happened before the assault was commenced at daylight was the blowing up of enemy ammunition dump on Vimy Ridge. The shock of this explosion was momentarily paralyzing, but was a mere incident to what followed. The Canadians waited in the dark with the cold rain pelting and a bitter wind driving over the desolate ground. The artillery had been pounding away for days, and every shell sent over had its own particular spot to fall on, for the British airplanes had performed a marvelous work in scouting as a preparation. This scouting work and the splendid artillery support made possible the great infantry work which followed. Heavy guns were the first brought to Vimy Ridge 3 days after Christmas. They were put into position in the morning and began firing that same afternoon, and have gone on ever since, so that it was real easy to see what is meant by artillery preparation. Competent estimates had been made that the Canadians could not advance against Vimy Ridge without losing 1/3 of their strength, but this estimate has been entirely disproven, for the casualty lists, while they will be heavy, will nonetheless be lighter than expert estimates. The air service and the artillery can be thanked for this satisfactory condition of the affairs. It is learned that nearly half the total prisoners taken fell into the hands of the Canadians. 2,000 were taken behind Vimy Ridge.
The Canadian 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Divisions attack went pretty much on schedule, which for a World War I battle was unheard of. With the help of rolling artillery, which basically means that the artillery was going off right in front of the Canadian troops, it allowed them to get to the German trenches just as the Germans were coming out of their bunkers. So the Germans would come out of their protective bunkers to find that Canadians were already in their trench or about to be. This helped the Canadians' 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Divisions reach their goals and have everything that they had set out at the beginning of the day to have completed by the end of the 9th of April. However, it did not go to all to plan. We'll cover that shortly.
Premier Borden today expressed feelings of pride and joy when he had read the dispatches telling of the great Canadian success at Vimy Ridge. He stated, quote, the story has thrilled me. It is with a feeling of pride that I realize that the strongly fortified positions which I saw in my recent visit to France are now in the hands of the British. I have sent a message to the Canadian Army expressing congratulations. I hope that this victory is only the augury of further triumphs. The great number of prisoners captured is proof of the thoroughness of the Canadian preparations. This message was sent to Sir John Byng.
The Canadian 4th Division was the one that had it the hardest. One of the major strongholds of the Germans that they faced was left pretty much untouched, and this was done on purpose. The Canadians had decided that that stronghold was needed to be taken intact so that it could be used as they went to attack the Pimple. The problem with that was that the Canadians of the 4th Division, unlike the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Division, had to go up against a completely intact German offensive, which was manned with machine guns and troops ready to go. The Canadian 4th Division suffered many casualties and many setbacks, and they were unable to reach their goal of having Hill 145 by the end of the 9th. It was only after calling in the Work Battalion, which was the Canadian Scots, also called the Highlanders Without Kilts, on the 10th. And when they were called into battle, they answered. Even though they were the worker battalion, they were supposed to be the ones that were digging the trenches for the wires, laying track, supplying troops. But they got called into action on the 10th, and they answered that call. And they drove the remaining Germans from Hill 145 so that by the end of the day on the 10th, the Canadians had all of Vimy except for the Pimple.
How Berlin tells it. Berlin, April 10th. Regarding the heavy fighting on the Western Front, today's Army headquarters statement reports that the battle near Arras continues. In stubbornly resisting the superiority of the enemy, added the statement, 2 of our divisions suffered considerable losses. The British succeeded in penetrating our positions on the roads radiating from Arras, but did not break through. The British attack was on a front of 20 kilometers and was launched after exceedingly violent artillery fire. Southeast of Ypres, the Germans penetrated beyond the third British line, says the report, and blew up shelters, returning with 50 prisoners and 7 machine guns and mine throwers.
The Germans after the battle would use many excuses for why the Canadians were so successful and why their battle plan did not work. Some of which were the fact that the troops were so fatigued and that they were so malnourished that they were unable to fight. The other problem they had was the Canadians during the week of suffering had attacked their supply lines so badly that the artillery guns of the Germans, not only were they dealing with the fact that they were being taken out left, right, and center, but they also had to deal with the fact that they didn't have the ammo to fire. Also, the troops in the trenches had the same problem. They didn't have enough ammunition for the battle at hand, and finding themselves unable to shoot because they didn't have the bullets to do so, because the Canadians had been so thorough in the week of suffering to ensure that the Germans were not going to be able to repel the attack.
London, April 10th. King George today sent his message to Field Marshal Haig. Quote, the whole empire will rejoice at the news of yesterday's successful operations. Canada will be proud that the taking of the coveted Vimy Ridge has fallen to the lot of her troops. I heartily congratulate you and all who have taken part in this splendid achievement.
I'd like to thank you for joining us. This has been our look at part 1 of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Next week, we will look at the Pimple, which is the Canadians' final push to take all objectives of Vimy Ridge.
I'm Richard Simpson.
And I'm Robert Knowles.
And please join us next week when we talk about Vimy Ridge Phase 2.